Hi, Geoff, and welcome guests.
Good morning, Mike.
Hi.
Well, we have a stranger in the gallery. We're going to get to him in a second. But first, we're going to let you know what's in the strategy suite coming up later in the episode. We're going to have more on the DRIPA drama. We're going to have an update on the Conservative race to replace. And wouldn't you know it, those two topics go hand in hand. We'll get into the details on that. But first, our guest today is a household name in Canadian politics and public life. Bob Rae, recently Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, former leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, former Premier of Ontario, elected to office 11 times between 1978, I'm dating him here, and 2011. And once he even moved a non-confidence motion that defeated the incumbent federal government. Bob, welcome to Hotel Pacifico.
I also moved one of the provincial government, so I had a twofer.
You had a twofer.
I was waiting for the hat trick, but it never came.
Well, if you run in a by-election in BC, you might get your chance here. Bob, it's a great honor to have you here joining us today to share your experience with our listeners. And where we want to take this discussion is kind of like, what does BC need to know about the world that's happening around us today? We sometimes are a bit insular. Sometimes we're, a little trapped in by our Rocky Mountains and our
some might even say parochial a little bit, yeah.
A little parochial. But we're a trading province and a trading nation, and what happens in the world really matters to us here. First of all, what is your impression of BC from someone who's practiced politics from Eastern Base over the years? Here we are, one of the larger provinces in Canada, but we never think we get enough respect. What's your impression of British Columbia from the outside?
Well, I have a huge amount of respect and love for British Columbia. I've worked in British Columbia on some fascinating issues over the years, principally on the building of pipelines and the relationship between the government and companies and Indigenous people. And I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to know BC better over the years. I mean, as you know, I was originally started out in Parliament as a New Democrat, and I was a member of a caucus that was very much affected by British Columbia. It was very important to the NDP in those days. We had some terrific members who were very close friends of mine. I was able to visit with them. Stu Leggett, who was a very close friend of mine, that later on became a judge. Jim Fulton, of course, renowned character, and represented what was then known as the Queen Charlotte Islands. But he was an active advocate, and a great guy, and a very close friend. Ian Waddell, I was at U of T when I was, and I knew him back then. He came originally from Etobicoke, although he never broadcast that in Vancouver, but those were his roots. Anyway, there was just a ton of people that I had a great relationship, and of course, Tommy Douglas was still in the House when I was elected.
Oh, wow.
So I've always felt a great connection to British Columbia, and I've been fascinated by the history and politics of the province, and it's a very critical part of Canada. Has an enormous amount to teach the country and to engage with the country. I've also been fascinated by the way in which some of the sort of anti-Canadian feeling that you get, or anti-federal feeling, or anti-Ottawa feeling that you get in Alberta, sometimes even Saskatchewan, you don't seem to get exactly in the same way at BC. I think obviously the Rocky Mountains seem to oppose a huge barrier, but really they don't, because you just fly over them. So it's not a big problem.
Well, let me clarify. We're not that upset that we don't get the respect. We're just indifferent.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but I do think
I would
there
agree
are
with that.
a lot of people
Okay.
in Eastern Canada who understand how important it is. And I spent 10 years of my life working on the softwood lumber file,
Right.
where my BC counterpart was Keith Mitchell,
Right.
a great character, great
Great
liberal,
lawyer from Ferris and Company.
wonderful Canadian, a great friend of mine over many years, tragically left us too soon. So I've lots of friends. I still have very good company with people in BC, and I spend a lot of time thinking about what needs to be done in order to kind of use BC as an important way of holding people together. And I try to get out as much as I can. I will be out on South Spring Island in June doing a thing with Mike Myers and company. And there'll be a big public speak fest there on the weekend at the beginning of June. I look forward to it. So we're keep really trying to renew my roots. When I was at the UN, I didn't get a chance to go to BC as much as I would have liked to, although I made it to Victoria a couple times. So I think that BC is a world unto itself. I mean, it is a culture and a geography that is unique, and it has relationships, and it doesn't need to be to feel in any way isolated. It's deeply implicated in the life of the country, and always has been. And it's been great to be able to get out there. I did get out to give one speech at Pearson College a couple of years ago, which was very enjoyable.
Well, looking at it from the other direction, do you think that the rest of Canada, particularly the English-speaking side, underestimates the possibilities for BC, or leaves it out of the calculation sometimes in national politics?
Yeah, I think that's an issue. I think, Geoff, I think that's a fair comment, a fair assessment of some of the challenge. I mean, part of it is it's out of sight, out of mind, right? I mean, it depends on the ability of the provinces to, each part of the country that feels it's not being taken seriously enough. It's really about how do you get the attention of federal politicians, and how do you make sure they're listening. I would venture to say, this is probably not intended to insult anybody, but I think that BC is underrepresented in the cabinet in this current government, which actually surprised me when I saw the cabinet formation. It struck me that they were missing some opportunities there to really have people who can plug into Ottawa and who can bring a particular perspective. There have been times in our national life when BC politicians have been absolutely key. Actually, it's interesting if you look back at our history. Justin Trudeau's father-in-law was a pretty dramatic figure in the life of British Columbia. And in the Saint-Laurent government, you wouldn't make any decisions on anything
or his grandfather
without consulting with Jimmy. And so that tradition in a way is not as strong as it was, but it should be. It's something we should be looking at, seeing who are the strong figures in the caucus who can come forward and represent the new BC. I think that's something that Mr. Carney would be wise to spend some time thinking about.
Well, let's go global here and start from there, Bob. You were the ambassador of the UN for 5 years, I think, from 2020 to 2025. What a fascinating perch on global events that you had. We've got this conflict in Iran right now. We're obviously seeing the impact of that with gas prices here, but obviously much bigger implications than that. What are you seeing as part of that conflict right now in terms of how Canada has to navigate its interests, and what are you concerned about that flows out of it ultimately?
Well, I think we have to understand that what the president has done has been to create a global crisis that ironically affects consumers in North America and makes them angry. But the impact globally is much, much more important. Where I think sometimes even, I was just chatting with somebody today about how we see the impact on gas prices, which becomes the number one issue, and that's understandable because anybody who's ever been in politics knows that gas prices are an important issue from the perspective of the driving public, particularly the driving male public, is a reality in terms of the impact. But I mean, they're shutting down whole countries in Asia. I mean, like, people aren't going to work, and it's not just the oil; it's also the food, and it's also the transportation of things like fertilizer and other stuff that comes out of that part of the world in huge tankers and goes straight through that very narrow piece of water, the Strait of Hormuz, and then heads out into the Indian Ocean, and it goes everywhere. all around Asia. It's affecting Asia, it's affecting Africa because of the same issues around access to energy, access to food, access to food production. These are going to be critical problems. And the thing is, you could turn off a tap and you can't turn it back on that quickly because it's all about how long it takes to get from one place to the other. The distances to transport goods from one part of, from that particular hub in the Middle East all the way around the world is huge. So we're in a deep trouble right now, and it's going to get worse until it finally gets better. Hopefully there'll be some sort of settlement or understanding reached and traffic will start to flow again. But everybody needs to understand that this is not just about, oh gosh, it's going to cost me an extra couple of bucks to drive. That's an issue. I'm not dismissing it. And it will affect inflation in Canada, which is not good because we don't need, we had that problem under control and now it's coming back to haunt us again, and that's not good. But this is a global problem that Mr. Trump has raised and created, and it's destabilizing, profoundly destabilizing, I think, for the reputation of the United States in developing countries, which was already poor, and is going to. I mean, I saw this with COVID when I first got to the UN. The issue of the day was COVID, and the thing about COVID was we were very, very on the seat of our chairs waiting for the first vaccine. Many other countries had to wait for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And by that time, it was, in a sense, the damage had been done. And I think that's something which has left a lasting impression on those countries.
Yes, presenting sponsor TELUS has been making the case for sovereign AI and that the choices we make now will shape Canada's economic future. Today, we're diving deeper into the data. Last week, we talked about the Canadarm, Canada's contribution to NASA's Space Shuttle program, which showed what sovereign procurement can do. It kept high-value jobs in manufacturing in Canada and turned a domestic firm into a global exporter. The Canadarm isn't a one-off success story. It's a blueprint. When we invest in sovereign companies, the economic benefits speak for themselves, starting with the jobs they create. Take the space sector as an example. Jobs backed by sovereign investment pay significantly more than the manufacturing average and bring a higher concentration of STEM roles that keep Canada at the cutting edge. And the economic benefits ripple outside of the industry. The Canadian Space Agency did the math. For every dollar spent on sovereign procurement, $3.60 was added to Canada's GDP. That's the sovereign dividend. But when we rely on foreign hyperscalers instead of investing in ourselves, the sovereign dividend disappears. AI could add $760 billion to Canada's GDP by 2035. Capturing that starts with strong, consistent definitions of sovereign and Canadian in the Buy Canadian policy, meaning companies that are headquartered here with end-to-end Canadian control. As TELUS has been saying, the choices we make now will determine who benefits. The data makes the case, so let's make the right investments for Canada and BC's AI future.
How will Trump's preoccupation with this? I mean, the striking thing to me is that he's had to pay attention to this issue for weeks now when he likes to do things in about 36 hours, whether it's, bring Maduro back to the United States or whatever the initiative is. How is this catastrophe in the Middle East going to play with our CUSMA negotiations and some of those things that are so vital to us? Will he swivel his attention back to them, or will we get a better deal as a result of his distraction? Do you have any insights in there?
I would say somewhat irreverently, and you seem to have a memory of my irreverence in my previous life, Geoff. I would say irreverently, the less attention he pays to CUSMA, the better.
Yeah.
Because the more it becomes a technical discussion between the trade lawyers and people really going through what the grievances are and how we can fix them, the better off we are. And the last thing we need is for Mr. Trump to be focusing all his attention on our issues. That's not a good thing. Now, that's not a reason to start a war or for Canada to wish that, how else can we distract it? But the fact is that if you were to ask business leaders on both sides of the border, how do we do this? There would be 80% support or 90% support for renewing the agreement, doing something more and figuring out how to deal with some problems that are difficult. And there are grievances on both sides. I mean, I mentioned softwood lumber. that's a big issue for us, a big issue for British Columbia, a big issue for northern Canada generally. And it is, you know, the Americans basically have got us over a barrel because the producing states in the United States are states that tend to be Republican, and where there's only two senators per state. So a relatively small portion of the American population has complete control over this issue in the U.S. Senate. And that's the geopolitics of that particular issue that's been tougher. But I think what Mr. Carney's trying to do is really take the lumber issue, for example, and say, well, how can we trade more with Europe? How can we link up more with Asia? How can we do more processing in Canada, create a broader industry? And I think that's the way we have to go. But it doesn't get over the fact that the biggest and most important market to us is the United States, and it's important for us to have it. But we've never had free trade in softwood lumber, as you know. We just have not had it.
No. Well, that's what I was going to get to, because there are certain issues that have been huge in BC politics over the years. And I'm thinking of softwood lumber, of course, but also the Pacific Salmon Treaty at one time was a big hotspot. Columbia River Treaty, huge resources at stake in each one. Are we just going to have to resign ourselves to taking some crumbs off the table? I mean, I think the Columbia negotiations may be substantially finished. I'm not sure if that's the case, but certainly Salmon Treaty is coming up, and these may be unfamiliar to British Columbia voters, but they have been big, big questions in the past. It sounds like we just have to take what we can get in these cases.
Well, again, I think it's really important. I mean, my memory extends way beyond my sort of adult life. I can remember listening in as a boy to a conversation between Davy Fulton and my father at a cottage in Ontario, and Davy was a very close friend of my dad's, and a really wonderful guy.
And for our listeners who may not know, Davy Fulton was a legendary MP from Kamloops for many years.
Yeah, from Kamloops, and he was he was a vital minister in the Diefenbaker government, and played a critical role in BC politics for a long time after that, and then eventually became a judge in British Columbia.
Right.
Anyway, but Davy was talking about the issue of the Columbia River, and was really explaining why this is so critical. The more you look at it, I remember he brought a map out, and we'd map on the dining room table saying, this is where it goes, this is the issues, this is where. And he was right at the center of the politics of Canada, talking about that and bringing it to the front and the forefront. Jack Austin did the same thing. He had a lot to do with putting that issue in the center of where Mr. Trudeau Sr.'s awareness was. I think those are issues that we've got to get back into really appreciating as all Canadians, that these are critically important issues that affect the overall health of the British Columbia economy. And the same thing's true for salmon. It's, the trouble with the salmon industry is that the salmon have a mind of their own.
Mm-hmm.
They don't necessarily know where the borders are. They just know where they're going and where they're coming back. So that can sometimes change everything.
Well, it's intriguing how early and deeply the integration of some parts of the economy occurred, because it was beneficial to both sides to do it. But now that we're drifting apart in terms of our perspectives, the underlying logic of a Columbia River Treaty may be disappearing, certainly in the eyes of some Americans, or maybe in the eyes of Canadians in terms of softwood lumber, because the agreement's been worthless to us.
But I think this raises the other issue, which we don't like to talk about, which I suspect the Americans are going to want to talk about more and more over the next decade, and that is water.
Mm-hmm.
We have turned water into a sacred icon for us. It's our water, and I think that's understandable. We know how tough the water issues are, whether it's Great Lakes or Northern Canada generally, or British Columbia. But all of us need to be aware that for the Americans, given what's happening in the southwest of the United States, this is an issue that will be. I don't really understand why it hasn't come forward, but I think it will. And if it doesn't come forward in this round of the negotiations, it will come around later on. And we could just say no, which is fine. But there may be other factors that would lead us to sort of think through, well, what is it that people are talking about? admittedly, that creates a whole other set of issues for provinces as well as for the general public. But we do need to be aware that it is an issue that will be put back on the table at some point.
Just with respect to BC's interests in the United States, do you think it would be wise for BC to set up a mission in Washington similar to what Ontario and Alberta have done? I think Quebec's down there as well, at least they're in New York. But BC doesn't currently, I think, have a presence diplomatically south of the border to that extent. Would it help?
I believe that the provinces in Washington would be very wise to be represented in the embassy. I have a bit of a history with this issue because I actually closed some of Ontario's offices and then insisted that we reopened within the structure of the Canadian, physical structure of the Canadian embassy. I mean, BC, I assume BC House is still in London, right? I mean, it's still there.
I don't think so, actually.
No, it's gone?
No.
It's a very
I
nice
think it's
place.
gone. Oh, no, it was lovely. Yeah.
No, but I think my answer
sublet
is, my answer to your question is, I think BC should be represented, but I think it should be represented within the frame, within the umbrella of the Canadian effort. Because one of the things that's not helpful, I think, is to have provinces that insist on, going off on their own and saying we'll have our own deals and our own arrangements, and it gets us into all kinds of constitutional and other issues. Certainly Alberta is present, Saskatchewan is present, and I think it's important for British Columbia to think about where this takes them and what other places do we need to be. I just think it's not sensible to say we're going to do this separate from our national government, which to me doesn't make sense.
Well, let's take a look west because BC is very integrated. Not integrated, but certainly a major exporter to Asia and to China,
Yes.
coal and liquefied natural gas and even agri-food products to Japan. It's a very important thing for us and for Canada generally. And we've struggled a bit with the connections to real estate. What do you think the future holds for our relationship with China? We see Prime Minister Carney now making what many would say is a very pragmatic approach and moving away from some of the emphasis we've seen on the past on human rights and forced labor and those kinds of issues. Is this going to be an area where we'll see a lot of emphasis from Ottawa and maybe a chance for the BC-Ottawa connection to get stronger?
Yes. What's your next question?
Okay, could you elaborate on that, please?
No, seriously, absolutely. I've been going to China since 1986 as a political figure in Ontario, and we had Tiananmen Square just a few years after that first visit, which I made with Premier Peterson, and I visited 3 times when I was premier. After Tiananmen, we took 2 years to talk about the issues and figure out how we can stabilize a discussion. But I think the thing we tried to do, and that was brought home by the Chrétien Team Canada missions, which I was part of in '94, is you have to learn how to do both. You have to learn how to have an ongoing dialogue and discussion based on knowledge, based on information, and based on up close discussion on what's going on at the ground. What is the security situation? What is the human rights situation? But at the same time, China is just too big to ignore. And to take a position that says, no, we're going to sit this one out. This is one part of the world we're not going to have anything to do with because they have a terrible human rights record. Well, you could spend a lot of time going through countries through Latin America, Africa, and pretty soon you've got a pretty small trading zone. Oh, and by the way, our major trading partner has got a lousy human rights record and an appalling environmental record and is turning towards autocracy. So, hey, how about just pulling out of there? I mean, we can't afford to take that attitude and that mindset as we go forward. We have to understand that the world, the battle for democracy goes on. It's certainly strengthened by the defeat of Orban earlier this week, but we have to recognize that democracy is a contested idea. Human rights are contested ideas in most parts of the world, where most of the people of the world live. And so we can't just say, well, no, we're not going to treat with these people, then we're just going to retreat into our own little selves. I mean, I think that's not the right attitude.
Well,
So
what do you say to
what I've urged
yeah,
consistently is let's separate out our diplomacy, our trading issues, our diplomatic recognition issues from our other aspects of things we'd like. We have a long-term interest in trying to improve. It's going to take a long time to improve the human rights issues in China, and it will require some political changes in China for that to happen. But it doesn't mean that in the meantime you say, well, we're not having anything to do with you. And with respect to China, the reason is quite simple, because it's too big, it's too important, and it's too important to our economy to ignore. And Mr. Carney knows that. And I think it's not this notion of are we friends? Could we still be friends? It's not about friendship. Friendship is there in some instances in certain ways, but the most important thing to understand is we have interests as a country in making sure that we have a reliable and strong trading relationship with China, and we need to take full account of the security implications, and we need to go in with our eyes wide open and with a fully engaged security relationship in which we understand what the implications are and we know what they're trying to do. I mean, I never had a conversation with the Chinese ambassador in New York with my cell phone on. I mean, there's just stuff you don't do because you got to be smart about these things.
Another pop quiz for our Hotel Pacifico listeners today from our sponsor, Fortis BC. What do Burnaby, Prince George, and Trail all have in common? Is it all three host post-secondary institutions? All three are located on river systems? All three cities are home to Fortis BC customer service call centers? Or all of the above? Well, if you pick D, all of the above, you're right. Bonus points if you can name the rivers in the post-secondary schools. But today I want to focus on those Fortis BC call centers and the people behind the phones who support Fortis BC's nearly 1.3 million gas and electric customers across BC. If you've ever called Fortis BC to start a service, ask a billing question, or about an energy rebate, or get help during an outage or emergency, you have spoken with someone in one of those centers. Because Fortis BC is local, and our call center staff are unionized employees committed to serving British Columbians. The people answering those calls aren't just employees. They're neighbors, parents, volunteers, and community members who live and work in the very same communities Fortis BC serves. Fortis BC's more than 2,700 employees proudly serve those customers in 135 BC communities and 58 First Nation communities across 150 traditional territories. So when customers reach out for help, they're often speaking to someone who understands their community because they're part of it. Fortis BC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast. In the past year, the province of BC and the federal government have pivoted on energy. Certainly the Carney government's much bolder on pursuing a new oil pipeline. The BC government is much bolder in pursuing LNG after some reticence from the early days of the EB government. How important do you think energy exports are to Canada's standing in the world in terms of what some would call hard power?
Well, I mean, we are potentially a very strong presence in the energy industry, but I mean, and here again, I would say that I'm not entirely. I'm not saying I'm at odds with the Carney government, but what I believe is we need, and this is true for provincial governments as well. We need a consistent narrative. Figure out what are we doing, and how long do you think we could do this for? There is an argument that I've certainly heard expressed by many people to say, well, even if you're going to move off coal towards cleaner fuels, and you're then going to eventually move to renewables in a much bigger way. There's still a window of opportunity for Canadian business to participate in the plans that many Asian countries have to use LNG, to use natural gas, and to take that line, even to use oil. So, do we want to say no? We're going to get out of that business. Well, you know what? The purest of the pure, the Norwegians, are not getting out of that business. They're not running away from the fact that they are an environmental country. They more than 50% of the cars sold in Norway are EVs. But they're saying, well, while there's a market there, we're going to do what we can to use it and to take advantage of it, build up whatever resources we can, and then to begin to move off it. There will be a process by which we move off oil. Right now, it's a fairly chaotic process. It's not planned. There's no global plan to say this is the stages at which it's going to happen, and this is how we're going to deal with the delay and the impact that greater climate change is going to have on the planet. But I don't think we can simply take ourselves out of the business and pretend that this is a smart move on our part. All it means is that somebody else will be doing what we could be doing. And I think that from an economic point of view, that doesn't make sense. But there also has to be, and what's I think missing in the national plan of the Prime Minister, is to say, yes, but we do have to have a plan to reduce emissions. And here's what it is. And here's the pace at which we're going to be doing it. And here's the pace at which we think the world should be doing it. By the way, this is what more we're going to do for those countries that are going to be very negatively impacted by the continuing reality of climate change. It's important to remember that if we had no emissions tomorrow, we would still have a huge problem with climate change. Because what climate change is really impacted by is the last 350, 400 years of the accumulation of what the scientists call junk in the atmosphere. And unless somebody can figure out a way to get the junk out and then try to regulate what that does to the climate of the planet, we're still going to have a problem, whether we reduce emissions or whether we get rid of emissions or not. And we have to face up to that in ways that I don't think we've been fully candid about, and really trying to say, well, how do we do this? And how does what we do connect to what everybody else does?
I think part of the national discourse, too, has been in the global scale of things, we're not that big a litter bug. Other people are throwing way more garbage out. And you mentioned the hard stop that the Straits of Hormuz blockades have imposed on some of the Asian economies. Do you think perversely there will be an emergence of some more collaboration on this front as a result of all of these shocks in the last few months?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's really tough, Geoff. I mean, everybody talks about these agreements we have every year now that meet at various cities around the world, all of which are large polluting places, and have a discussion about climate change. And you say, look, at the end of the day, you come up with an agreement that's not enforceable and that doesn't lead to any real serious action. And the geopolitics of this are deeply affected by the absence of the United States from any serious conversation on this subject. But we have to I think take a course in which we say, here's where we're going, and this is how we think it's connected to where everyone else in the world is going. And it can't be based on righteous virtue signaling as a national policy. Mm-hmm. We're an energy producer. We're an energy producing country. We produce, I think we should get off coal. I mean, I think at some point you say, okay, enough of that. I know there are people in British Columbia who disagree. Alberta, people disagree. But I think we should say goodbye to that. I think we should figure out how long we think we could be in the natural gas business and how long we can be in the oil business. I do think these are finite resources. They're not going to exist forever. I do think we have to get off fossil fuels as a planet. But I think we need a plan to do that, and we can't pretend that we in Canada control all the cards with respect to that plan. If you look at the dynamic of the climate negotiations that I've seen and witnessed and listened to, you've got the United States, which is a major petrostate, and you've got the Gulf countries, which are major petrostates. You've got Russia, which is a smaller, but very, very needy petrostate. And you've got some other producing countries in different parts of the world who won the lottery and they've discovered oil for a decade or 20 years, and they're going to make some money out of that. But we need to be real about what actually is going to be possible and how it's actually going to be enforced. And I'm not sure it's been that possible to have a rational conversation with people, because sometimes people say, well, if we stop selling oil, then there won't be any more forest fires in British Columbia. And you just say, that's bullshit. Like, what are you talking about? There's not a direct cause and effect between what we do here and the lingering impacts of the ongoing impacts of climate change in different parts of the world, including Canada, which, as you know, have been devastated by forest fires over the last decade.
Bob, as you touched on earlier, you were involved in the negotiations of the Pacific Trail pipeline, which was a proposed natural gas pipeline corridor from Treaty 8 territory in Northeast BC to Kitimat. You were basically negotiating an ownership stake for First Nations in that pipeline, as I understand it. What did you, and this was the previous decade when there was a lot of the first round of LNG action in BC. So taking the energy issue to the Indigenous angle here, what did you take away from that in terms of the aspirations of First Nations to participate in not just energy, but just generally take an ownership stake in industry? And where do you see that going in the future?
Well, I think it's a huge part of our present and our future. Again, practically speaking, there won't be a pipeline unless there's Indigenous participation. That's basically become the standard that, in a way, Mr. Trudeau created, and then became sort of the standard language that people understood. There are some challenging issues for First Nations and for governments, provincial and federal, having to do with what is consent exactly, what is being consented to. Particularly in BC, you've got traditional chiefs, traditional structures where you have people who are not elected, and then you have the Indian Act communities that are elected, and frequently it's the Indian Act communities that are elected that want to move ahead. And certainly that was the case in the negotiations that I was part of. And we also had a real challenge in getting governments to realize that if they wanted these projects to go ahead, the private sector was not going to do it without a whole lot of help. Even some of the big companies like Chevron and the Australians, Woodbridge, those companies, they say, yeah, we're ready to go, and we're ready. Is this investment ready? And we're ready. And unless you have a provincial and federal government who are championing this thing and saying, here's what we're going to do to make this happen because it's good and because it's necessary. And that message was not consistent coming from either provincial or federal governments. And in order to do it effectively, you've got to have one crowd talking to the Indigenous people, not two. The crowd has to come together with a common position. And when that happens, you can make progress. And this particular problem of dealing with, how do you measure consent? If you have a pipeline with 16 First Nations, what is the governance structure that will come up with a consent proposition that is based on free, prior, and informed consultation? And it's doable. The whole thing is doable, but it has to be joined up in a significant way. And when I was at it, which is now 10 years ago, we didn't really have the full attention of the governments we needed, and that was a problem.
That's arguably changed now.
Yes, I think
Yeah.
it has, and that's good.
Well, but the terrain is more complex on the Indigenous side. I mean, I
Yes.
don't know if you had a chance to take a look at the BC legislation, which is so contested now, but there's federal legislation too. Is there any lessons that you've gleaned from watching these debates about how to move forward from a legislative standpoint on this?
On the
front?
Well,
are
the
you,
ju-
re-
the
are you
judges-
referring
the
to the DRIPA stuff, Jeff? Or
Yeah,
the,
DRIPA, but there's also an UNDRIP
Yeah.
legislation federally. I mean, they have to be
Yeah.
aligned if it's going to work.
Well, that's it. I mean, these things were done in the spirit of great enthusiasm, and without people really thinking through what does that mean? What is it? What does prior informed consent mean? And then when a court comes in and says, well, actually, on the environmental side, the chiefs that have to approve it are the traditional chiefs. And I must confess to say, I don't know how you could leave the fate of an entire pipeline in the hands of folks who are unelected, and you just got to develop some kind of accountability and say, well, do we have a referendum? Do we have some kind of popular consent coming from within the Indigenous communities? Can we have a democratic discussion about what does it take to have full consent? And those are the issues that need to be worked through in some detail.
When wild salmon return, coastal communities and economies thrive. By transitioning away from Pacific ocean-based salmon farms, we can rebuild salmon runs and restore the health of our waters, reviving ecosystems that coastal communities rely on, bringing back tourism, expanding local business, and generating thousands of good year-round jobs across coastal regions. And we can create new opportunities with future-focused industries like modernized land-based aquaculture that protects wild salmon, strengthens food security, and supports workers and families. That's according to our new sponsor, Wild First. For them, it's essential nation-building work, built in partnership with First Nations, that will unlock long-term economic opportunity and attract global investment to Canada's coastal industries. Let's secure a strong, sustainable coastal economy for generations with the wild salmon economy. Wild First. Let opportunity flow. Visit wildfirst.ca.
I'm a big supporter of UNDRIP, and I'm a big supporter of what the governments have tried to do in terms of integrating the principles into Canadian law. But I think when that process starts, we need to have a really good discussion and a clearer legislation on exactly what it means. What you have a pipeline with 16 or 17 First Nations on it. What does consent mean? Does it mean each First Nation? Some of them that have relatively small populations, and many members who live, off reserve. And then you say, okay, so how does this get done in a way that actually reflects the interests and the views of the people who are living in those communities? And I think in some instances, people, there is going to be a debate about what are we doing with this particular substance going through our territory. In other cases, people will say, well, yes, there are risks, but they're risks worth taking, and the revenue from that is going to flow to our communities. And our communities have not had the money and the investment and the attention that they deserve. It's a very legitimate debate. And it is one that you can't just hand it over to whoever can get the most people onto a demonstration, and how many people can you do to blockade a democratic decision that's made by a working majority of people. I mean, there are some democratic principles here that need to be injected into the conversation, and I think that's important.
Another moving around the issues here that I wanted to talk to you about, given your personal experience on this file, is You were appointed some years ago by the Public Safety Minister to author a report on the 1985 Air India bombing. It was called Lessons Learned, I believe, which undoubtedly put you front and center with the families involved. You said at the time the bombing of Air India Flight 182 was a Canadian tragedy. I think probably underlining Canadian was your point there. In fact, it was planned here in BC. It was planned. It was operationalized. The bombs left from YVR on separate planes. You said recently on the Hurley Burley podcast that you felt the Canada-India relationship was too influenced by domestic politics. So with all that foregoing preamble, what is the lingering impact of the Air India bombing on the Canada-India relationship, and how do you see that relationship going forward as well?
Well, it's a critical issue, and I think it's important for it to be discussed. And I've been talking about this issue with members of the Sikh community, members of the broader Indian community, with MPs. My friendship with Ujjwal Dosanjh, who was my fellow NDP premier, very good friend, and I feel very strongly that collectively as Canadians and Canadian governments generally have for a long time paid very little attention to what really happened and what the implications of that are. And so that's why in my report, which was really the precursor to the judicial inquiry, which came later, which pretty much endorsed what I had found, and went even further in terms of going into the details of what else needed to be done, only some of which governments have actually done, has meant that when Canadian politicians used to go to India, they would only go to Punjab. And that would be their relationship. They'd say, well, and the Indian government in New Delhi would say, well, what about us? Like, don't you understand the nature of this relationship? Don't you understand how contentious some of these issues are in our own country? At the same time, it has to be said that when Joe Clark was Foreign Affairs Minister, he made it very clear to the Indian government that their security presence in Canada was over the top. This is not a recent discovery that the Indian government has had security officials working in our country, and we've never really figured out how to deal with that in an effective way. I think what's happened recently has been a much more intense discussion between the two governments about what's really happening, and this is again something which causes issues within some elements of the Sikh community. But we really have to get a handle on the importance of the Canada-India relationship. That we're not going to, we have no business interfering in the internal dynamics of politics in India. That we're a federal country, and it's a little bizarre for us to say, oh, we really have no views about the unity of India. We should have been absolutely flat out clear at every step of the way that we support the existence of a federal India. We support the role of the federal government of India. We want to continue with our relationship. And as with China, we've tended to take a particular incident of one kind or another and said, okay, that means everything else stops. And we see what the implication of that was. So we have to get things back on the rails, whether it's Saudi Arabia, India, other situations. We cannot let the internal politics of the community here completely dominate the nature of the discussion as it comes to trade or politics and other elements of our relationship with India. And I have been saying this to each prime minister as clearly as I could. Do not underestimate the challenge that is posed by the open support for an independent Khalistan by many people in Toronto and Vancouver on the radio and in Punjabi language broadcasts. I don't think this is something that we could just drive by quietly and say, no problem here. This is not an issue for us. We need to recognize free speech in our own country, yes, But we also need to understand that there has been an issue going back to the 1970s and 80s that we've not really been able to figure out how to deal with. And the consequence of that failure was the Air India bombing. That's why I emphasize the importance of people. You remember Prime Minister Mulroney phoned the Prime Minister of India to apologize, express his regrets to him for all the people, all the Indians who've been killed on the plane. And Mr. Gandhi said, don't you know, most of those people are Canadian citizens with Canadian passports. We let that event go by without a real recognition by Canada of the fact that there were over 300 Canadians who were killed on a plane. And we said, oh, that's terrible. What happened to those Indians? Well, it didn't. And I can show you the examples of where we just missed the boat in describing and understanding and integrating into our understanding what happened. And so I came late into the game, 20 years after the bombing, and said, wow, have we ever got a lot of ground to cover here? We've got a lot of unhappy families who are devastated by their loss, feeling that this loss was not recognized. And we've not been able to get it right. Although I think we are taking the steps to get it right. I think we are finding the language that allows us to go forward, which is very important.
Do you think the security forces, and this is becoming a bigger issue, our Canadian security people are able to make a distinction between advocacy or free speech here in BC about Khalistan and launching attacks on India from BC? I mean, are we able to? This seems to be the nub of part of India's concern. They have an over-the-top security apparatus here because they don't believe we're doing our job on the security side.
I don't think it's just the Indians' concern about the security issue. I think of the security services. I think their concern is the political direction of government. Is the government of Canada in its own security assessment, and is the BC government in their security assessment taking sufficient account of the risk to human life that, well, certainly we didn't in 1985. And now we have to say, well, what is the level of concern? How do we deal with it effectively to avoid the kinds of tragedies that have taken place? I mean, look, India has issues with respect to its internal democracy, and there are all kinds of debates going on about how this needs to be worked out, how this needs to be dealt with. Mr. Modi hoped that he would get a big majority in the last election. He didn't. He's now in a minority parliament. And I think there just has to be an awareness of what is the level of concern in India. And we need to understand that Canada's own failure to address this issue in 1985 and subsequently is what has led to this sense in the Indian government that we are insufficiently aware of the security implications for us as well as for them I
don't know what Mike's experience was, but I never heard such a discussion when I was in the BC government.
No, I mentioned it if you want. I mean, I commend my report to you because I talk about the fact that without being aware of it, politicians of all stripes would go into demonstrations and events which were effectively a celebration of the man who is widely believed to have been responsible for the bombing. And that's ridiculous. I mean, we need to understand why that seems so offensive to the government of India.
Yeah, we talk a lot about foreign interference in Canada.
Yeah.
And shoes
we
on
need
the other foot.
Exactly right. It's a two-way street.
Well, Bob, with your experience as we talked about the outset of the show on confidence votes, we can't let you go without talking about our current situation here in BC,
confidence.
where we thought we were heading to a confidence vote in the next week or two, and that apparently has been short-circuited now. But we are a 47-46 legislature, 46 being split between a few opposition voices, parties, but still ultimately there's been a lot of 47-46 votes. We've got NDP MLAs that are definitely wobbly on the government's approach to DRIPA. The Greens pulled out of the confidence arrangement with the NDP, which removed a cushion from them. So given that you have done a twofer, federally and provincially, and lived in these minority government situations, like how does it look from the outside in terms of what you think the pressure is on the government right now, and what you would anticipate, their reaction to the situation would be to survive in the medium term.
Well, I mean, as I always remind people, what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is you lose, you have an election, and then you see what happens. I mean, that's living in a democracy. So it's not like we're facing, this is 1917 of the Russian Revolution or something. This is just
Oh no, it could be getting there. It could be getting there.
This is a normal event in a minority parliament.
Don't know who Rasputin is out here, but I'm sure he's around somewhere.
Well, I always thought that one of the great mistakes that was made in governing a minority was made by Mr. Clark in 1979 when he won a minority and defeated Mr. Trudeau, and Mr. Trudeau resigned. But there was no, Joe Clark's first press conference, he said, "I'm going to govern as if I have a majority." And I can remember saying to somebody, that's sort of like jumping out of a plane and saying, "I'm jumping out of this plane as if I had a parachute. And if you don't have a parachute, you're pretty well not going to make it." So it's important for everyone to be aware of what's at stake. Governments have to be careful not to fall over themselves for the sake of avoiding a vote when the bigger issue is what is their level of support in the province for the government. And what is the likelihood of, how's that going to work and how's that going to happen? That's a calculation that you have to make. But it is, when I was in 85 to 87 in a minority relationship with Mr. Peterson, I signed an accord. And in the NDP at the time, there's a lot of, across the country, there was a lot of, dismissal, saying, "Oh, that's ridiculous. Why would you do that?" I said, "Because I want to avoid playing Russian roulette every day. I would like to have some degree of stability, and I think I could get more for my support than I could get from bargaining a little chip here, a little chip there. I don't want to do that." And I think if you could have a stable accord with a stable set of policies, either being inside or outside the government, that we decide to stay out, other situations have been cabinet ministers, that's, in European terms, that's perfectly normal. That's, the minority government is a normal thing. Majority government is a rarity.
Well, you told me back in 2017 that what was required was arithmetic and chemistry. And, it turned out that John Horgan had good marks in both classes, ultimately, and had that stability. And
we all miss him. I certainly do. John was a great man. I know Geoff worked for him, but he was, when I talked to him not long before he died, we had a wonderful conversation about our experiences in minorities or other situations when he was the ambassador in Germany. Very great guy, wonderful person, and with almost unique political skills. It does take something like that to kind of say, well, wait a minute, now, how can we get these things back on the rails? What is it you really want? How do we do it? But like I said, if it ain't there, it ain't there, and you can't. It's all about arithmetic and chemistry. Exactly right.
You mentioned you gave quite a moving tribute to Stephen Lewis on a podcast I listened to recently. You knew him. You were in the NDP, and you started in politics as a social democrat. Since we've got you here on the podcast, I'm just curious to get your reflection on the political journey you made and whether you would still see yourself as a social democrat in most respects, or whether you parted ways with some part of social democratic thinking when you left, because you talked about how you became your friendship with Stephen Lewis persisted, even though he could have called you an apostate throughout that. I think
apostate was probably.
Did you feel like an apostate?
Was probably the nicest thing. He talked to them. And by the way, for your listeners, apostate is not an organ in the male body; it's something else. No, I mean, yes, I still am a social democrat in my basic thinking. That's how I see the relationship between markets and democracy. I'm a strong supporter of trade unions, strong supporter of human rights, strong supporter of greater equality in relationships. And I do think that modern day capitalism is going too far in the not dealing with the inequalities in wealth. My disagreement, I think, with the New Democrats over the years grew after I left the legislature after my defeat in 2005, and it had everything to do with my feeling that the party had gone too far left. The party was only too quick to abandon some of the difficult decisions that you have to make in government. And eventually, as time went on, I thought that I see the Liberal Party, certainly the Liberal Party that I was part of, as having a very strong connection with social democracy. People might be uncomfortable with the word, but it doesn't bother me. I'm also a liberal in a small L sense, and for practical purposes in most elections, we're in a big L sense. So I don't think I'm unique in that regard. I think many liberals at the federal level are effectively social democrats in their thinking, by which I mean they believe strongly in advancing democracy, advancing people's social conditions. I was standing next to Danielle Martin yesterday after her victory in Toronto. I've known her since before she was born. I'm very close friends with her parents. So, I mean, she gave a speech that I would call a classic social democratic speech, where she talked about healthcare. And then she talked about the economy. So the extent to which when social democracy stops talking about the economy in practical terms, in terms that people can understand and relate to, then it becomes irrelevant. And I think that's always been the risk for the NDP. But where the NDP has succeeded in British Columbia, Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, if I was living in those provinces, I would be voting for the New Democratic Party in a provincial election. I mean, no big deal. I mean, it's a reality of our current situation.
Well, I would urge you to read the budget before you head to the.
I'm not saying I would vote for them. I mean, luckily, I am in Toronto now, so I will make up my mind how I vote. But I would say to people that I think it's you got to, in a way, get over some labels.
Yeah.
But
there's certainly a big hole in the center here in British Columbia right now. That's for sure.
Somebody needs to fill it.
Yeah. Bob, this has been a fantastic discussion. I know our listeners will have benefited greatly from your insights and experience, and getting a little outside perspective on BC. We're usually in our little bubble here, but it's nice to reach out over the Rockies and hear from the
great chatting with you guys.
Gray Eminence.
Happy to do it, and I'll stay connected as much as I can.
I appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
All right, here in the Strategy Suite with Geoff. It's been a busy week thinking about all these scenarios that were about to happen and now are not about to happen.
It's been an epic week, counting back 7 days we're recording on a Tuesday.
Yeah.
So I would say the entire plot has changed. The cast remained the same, but the plot has changed at least twice dramatically, and since we last met with our
I think the main
trusty band of listeners.
Yeah, I mean, I think things really moved into overdrive on Friday when Stuart Phillip hit the podium and laid the lumber on Premier Eby and made it clear that I'm not going to speak on behalf of my wife, but I can tell you she's not going to vote for this. I'll vote for DRIPA, Joan Phillip, that is. Then apparently, Geoff, there was an emergency NDP caucus meeting on the weekend, I'm told. Or I think Katie DeRosa reported
They did do
that.
a meeting, but just to roll back quickly for our listeners, some of whom may have been in hiding or
Seclusion.
something. I mean, the Premier had declared early on in this whole controversy, even before Christmas, that he wanted to make amendments to DRIPA and to the Interpretation Act to overcome the negative consequences of especially this Gitsala decision, which was a Court of Appeal decision about whether or not the province's mining regulations, particularly prospecting, were aligned with DRIPA. And the court found that they weren't and made quite a far-reaching decision that shocked a lot of people who were involved in the drafting of the bill. But the Premier's declaration that he wanted to make amendments fell afoul of immediate opposition and very widespread opposition from First Nations leaders who said no, that wasn't the answer. And so from that point on, I think it was foreseeable that there'd be a problem because for the Premier, at least 3 Indigenous members had of the NDP in caucus saw their own organizations take strong positions against changes to DRIPA. So they were put in the unfortunate position, potentially, of having to vote for the government in order for it to pass, as opposed to the direction that their own community was taking. Not just their, and by the way, the concern about amendments goes beyond the Indigenous community. And there's lots of people in the non-Indigenous community who would prefer not to see it.
Well, I think Katie DeRosa was reporting that they're up to 10 MLAs that were saying they could not support it.
Yeah, well, so this has been burbling and burbling and burbling on. The Premier says, okay, I've got some amendments. I'm going to meet with the First Nations Leadership Council. The amendments are non-negotiable. That meeting went very badly because as he came in the door, he'd changed his mind. They were ready to respond to the non-negotiable amendments, and he said, well, actually, maybe I'll just suspend the operation of parts of the bill that bother me. And that insulted many of the leaders even more because they well recall the days when BC law prohibited Indigenous organizations from even hiring a lawyer. So the idea that you would suspend legislation because it was inconvenient to the government was deeply offensive and consolidated the opposition. And so coming into the weekend, there was a Friday unprecedented press conference. Maybe you've seen something like that. I never have. Lasted 90 minutes. Many, many senior leaders from right across the province, I think 10 or so, spoke at length. And one of them was Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, whose partner, Amjan Joan Phillip, is MLA for Vancouver Strathcona. And he said, as you've reported just now, that she would not support the amendment. So right away, right on the spot, the Premier's possibility of passing this confidence motion, which he had declared vaporized. Why he hadn't foreseen this is something that I hope we find out sometime.
I am surprised by that. And I had a conversation with an NDP MLA in December about like, how are you going to get these DRIPA, amendments through with these members of caucus you've got? Like, how can they possibly support that?
Right.
And that was just my dumb outside
Fair question.
view, but I think there's always, when you're part of a team, part of a caucus team, everyone's working together, you kind of think that it's always going to stay together maybe. But I think the pressure was obviously, the pressure may not have mattered. It may have been their own conscience that they never would have voted for it anyways, but the pressure must have been pretty fierce coming from the First Nation leaders.
It was very fierce, but I think also, ironically, the decision to make it a confidence matter, which, as John Palmer's pointed out, the Premier's done on a number of occasions when the stakes were far lower. He may have had the opposite effect of what he wanted by making some of those folks feel bullied, that they hadn't been secret about their concerns, and that this conflict was obvious and foreseeable. To make a long story short, there was an emergency meeting. Katie DeRosa of the CBC reported that there was at least 10 members of caucus who expressed concern. That doesn't mean they would vote against, but you and I have been there, Mike. It's not a good sign when the Premier is confronted in a caucus meeting by, 25% of the caucus expressing concerns, whatever that means. So on Monday morning, Mike Farnworth came out and said, well, we're not going to go forward this week after all, and we're not going to have a confidence vote. So the pressure came off to a degree, but the crisis continues with the Premier now looking for support among opposition members of the House for a non-confidence motion that will somehow resolve this question. It's not clear what that would look like, but probably suspension of some parts of the bill.
I think you'd have to go back to the HST debacle for when a government was really on the ropes internally within its
Gordon
caucus.
Campbell,
because there was a lot of caucus upset over the HST. Now, they haven't had anyone walk across the floor because of it, and in Gordon Campbell's case, he did lose a member. But I can't think of anything under Christie's or Horgan's watch that was this intense.
No.
We'll see. So, Eby and his leadership, like, is it a given? Is it,
Well, it's a paradoxical situation because he decided to make it a confidence matter.
Yeah.
It was not in the nature of things that it was, because normally that's a money bill. There's usually only 1 or 2 confidence votes in a session around the budget. and yet there is the ability of a premier or a House leader to declare something a matter of confidence. In which case, if you lose, you have an election.
Yeah.
The premier announced this would be a confidence matter, and it appears to have been his decision, and in the absence of a really clear understanding of where some of those votes might not come from. So he just won an 83% mandate at the NDP convention in October, very handily. There was, there had been concern during the summer that there was unhappiness with his leadership, but he got that mandate. Like a lot of parties these days, it's one person, one vote. The caucus can make life miserable for a leader, but the constitutional ability to remove someone lies at a convention.
Yeah, well, I think if you lose your caucus, you're toast.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
there's no
As a
leaders that
practical
can
matter.
continue on without the support of their caucus. Certainly a majority of caucus.
Well, that depends on whether there's somebody who feels they could do a better job.
Well, that's a big question.
And, the NDP remains traumatized by the Carol James affair. Carol James was doing very well in the polls against Christy Clark in an election.
Mm-hmm.
She hadn't won. She'd had 2 outings and lost, but was
Oh, she was doing good in the polls against Gordon Campbell. I think she was turfed before Christie was even leader.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I've got my chronology
Yeah.
mixed up. Thanks for that. But the bottom line is that was a traumatic experience that took the NDP a long time to overcome. So there's very great reluctance and reticence inside to engage in any kind of rambunctious
But if
coup like that.
if they advance the DRIPA legislation, or I assume they will, and it fails, and it doesn't pass,
Mm-hmm.
as far as I'm concerned, it's just the same as a confidence vote. I mean, the government would be in
Yeah.
chaos.
Yeah.
The business community would be up in arms. What signal is that sending that here is the biggest issue and we can't get consensus on it? Do they just keep trying until they pass something?
Well, this was the other thing that was amazing to me was that Farnworth said, we'll extend the session, which has got about 20 days left in it now, if we need to. So
Yeah.
that's extraordinary because, they've used closure, they've used confidence votes. So I think the other question is, would there be a viable political strategy for the premier to come out on a Monday, for example, and say, you know what, I've got this wrong, and we're going to stop here for 6 months. We'll try to get something ready for the fall session. I'm going to try to rebuild my relationship with First Nations. I'm going to talk about some of the real problems we have. One of the big problems I think the government faces is that the premier's defined the problem he's trying to solve as a liability, a legal litigation liability risk that people are using the Getsala decision to improve their pleadings in a bunch of cases, some of which I understand were already there, so there was some risk to begin with. But now they have a new argument. And he's going to this enormous amount of trouble to put those in abeyance somehow by suspending the act or by changing the Interpretation Act. Who knows exactly what his legislation will look like. And I think it's hard for British Columbians to understand why, when so much is going on in the province in terms of the economy and affordability and you name it, that we're completely bogged down on this question over lawsuits that may have been in place already. There's a challenge for First Nations leaders too to, look at the bigger picture here from the point of view of the long-term needs of their communities and what the best legal outcome is. So I'm not saying that they should agree to what the government is saying, but they're going to have to, I think, be more creative in the next little while about how they find a way forward on this, whatever happens in terms of the House. I guess we will not have an election, but I agree with you. A lost vote is tantamount to a lost confidence motion, even if it doesn't force an election.
Well, in the meantime, May 30th, back to scheduled programming for the BC Conservative leadership race. Yeah,
Right.
This DRIPA drama was having its own drama within the BC Conservatives over the last 72 hours because if there was a snap election, who's going to lead them? And I mischievously put out a tweet on Friday saying, what are the odds of Premier Trevor Halford? And got quite a reaction. Turns out 0%. But it was actually an honest question just to surface, which was like, what is going to happen if the government falls before May 30th? What are the Conservatives going to do? Because logistically, it was going to be very problematic. And I think Mo Amir had responded to me saying that on his show, Angelo Isidoro had said that it would be Trevor Halford, in a snap call, because there wasn't any logistical way to pick the leader. The Caroline Elliott campaign put out a statement saying, oh no, there needs to be a vote as quickly as possible, so the members aren't denied their opportunity. So, and that you can read
But
into that.
she
That
got a lot of
Caroline Elliott
grief.
feels pretty good about her chances if in that scenario.
But she got a lot of grief for that comment, didn't she?
Well, I think they were defending their position, right?
Yeah,
Which is like, well, we were putting all this work in to run a leadership campaign. We at least want to have a chance to, finish it. I didn't hear Peter Millibar say anything about it other than he wanted the government to be defeated, and I'm sure he would have been happy with a caucus vote. And Ian Black, I think, was just like, I'll do whatever it takes to help everybody. Ian continues his little trying to weave his way to the top by getting along with everybody. But since last week on the conservative stuff, Dylan Kruger and I had a good chat on the weekend on Race to Replace, our conservative pod series that's just launched. Since we recorded on Sunday, Warren Ham dropped out of the race. The Rosslyn contractor, who was everyone's sixth favorite candidate, he endorsed Yuri Fulmer. And right now, this week, they're in the final sprint on the membership sales, which the deadline is the 18th at 5 o'clock. It's also the deadline for the final financial installment. I feel like we can expect all 5 of the remaining candidates to stay on the ballot. I would think Carrie Lynn Finley and Yuri Fulmer will probably stay on the ballot to the end. Maybe they think they're in the top 3. Mm-hmm. Who knows? But there was now that confidence vote's been settled that it's not going to happen, at least probably not going to happen before May 30th, Conservatives can just go back to doing what they were doing and try to win the leadership race. And I'm told there's about maybe 26,000 members in the tank right now at Conservative headquarters. And, I would think by Saturday there'll be well over 30,000. So they've built up some numbers during the course of the race here.
Well, I'll be very interested to see. It struck me that Elliott's campaign was making a logical point because the voting is online and that possibly they could move it up. But I don't believe, I don't know if anybody has suggested it, but I don't believe that this was all an effort by David Eby to somehow wind up in an election before the Conservative leader was picked. I think that it was him working his own file in terms of this legislation, not so successfully.
Well, I'm sure there are at least some people in the back room calculating, what if? Mm-hmm. Leger Poll came out, has the NDP ahead. I think if there was an election, it would be a bit of a different dynamic immediately when everybody wakes up, and it'd be very risky for the NDP, but not out of the picture that they could win an election. And, sometimes governments have to say, well, it might not get any better. Maybe now's the time. But after this week, it didn't feel like the NDP were a totally happy group to be heading into an election.
No,
so
a bit of work's required to sort through this thing for sure.
Bit of therapy.
Yeah.
Well, we've been working hard here, Geoff. Well, how about the mini bar? Should we head there?
Okay.
Do you have one this week?
Yeah. I guess it's a shot at Doug McCallum, 3-time mayor of Surrey. First in the 90s, and now, and then again about 10 years later, and then he was defeated at the last.
He's almost
outing.
90.
He's 80. He's 80, so he would be 80.
82, I think.
82, yeah. He would be definitely a senior by the time the next term ends. Yeah,
Super
I don't
senior.
know. I don't know. That makes it 5 in the mayoral race in Surrey, and I think McCallum. He's not. Of course, he's an excellent politician in lots of ways, and he's pushing some big items, but one of them is a 4-year tax freeze, 0% increase for 4 years, but also another SkyTrain extension, this time to Newton, new swimming pools, all very popular stuff. While the city is still digesting very, very difficult transition to a new police force, which was one of the things that he championed last time. Actually, I guess he would look back on his last term where he promised the SkyTrain and a new police force as successful because both have happened. But he's got an even bigger agenda this time. I think it's a bridge too far. I'm sorry, Doug. I think it's too late. But we'll see what happens. Maybe the voters of Surrey have unbounded confidence in him. There's 5 strong candidates there. It's going to be quite a brawl.
Yeah. Well, there's Tough Grandma, Brenda Locke. There's Mike Starchuk, former
Mike
NDP
Starchuk,
MLA.
yeah.
There's Linda Annis, current city councillor. And there is the Conservative candidate who lost to Gary Begg by 18 votes, or whatever it was, 22 votes.
22, yeah.
And he's in the race, I think, under the Surrey Conservative banner.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first Conservative banner we've seen trotted out. So who knows? I mean, my money's on Tough Grandma. Mine this week.
Brenda Locke for new listeners.
Yeah. I'm trying to popularize it. I know she likes to be referred to as Nona, but I like Tough Grandma. I'm going to raise a glass. I'm sure you'll join me on this one, Geoff. Grace Lohr, who put out an Instagram post this week. She's recovering from surgery and will be taking a pause to recover from her surgery. She's been through the ringer on her cancer journey. So wishing her the best and her family. But I'll take a shot at I'm going to take a shot at the NDP government on. I want to put some more focus back on the economic record while this DRIPA drama unfolds. You know, BC's economy is not in a good place. BC Business Council put out numbers that since 2019, we've had private sector job growth of 2% and public sector job growth of 41%. So that kind of puts it into focus. Other provinces were at 2%. Alberta, 16% private sector job growth during that time. Manitoba, 13%. Ontario, 10%. So clearly, our provincial economy is lagging behind in private sector job growth. We need to do better. Well, if we do better, there'll be a lower deficit. There'll be more money for healthcare. Everyone will be happy. So, thanks to Bob Ray for visiting Hotel Pacifico this week.
Very much so.
And to our sponsors for allowing us to bring this episode to you for free. I will see you on the weekend with Dylan Kruger at Race to Replace BC Conservatives for episode number 2. But on Hotel Pacifico, I will see you next week with you, Geoff. BC, you can never leave.